He missed a train that morning and had no idea that single mistake would decide whether dozens of men lived or died, because by nightfall, he would be standing in a place where courage mattered more than weapons, and every quiet choice he made would echo through history. The morning began like any other, quiet in a way that only early hours during wartime could be. The sky above the small European train station was still pale, stretched thin between night and day, as if even the sun was hesitant to rise. Cold air hung low, carrying the mixed smells of coal smoke. Damp wood and coffee poured too quickly into chipped cups. Boots echoed softly against the platform stones, not in marching rhythm, but in scattered, uncertain steps. This was not a battlefield. This was the last place where life still pretended to be normal. The soldier stood near the edge of the platform, his duffel bag resting at his feet. He was young, younger than the uniform made him look. The fabric still felt stiff on his shoulders, as if it hadn't yet learned the shape of his body. His helmet sat beside him, untouched, because here, in this moment, he was still allowed to feel like a man instead of a target. He kept checking the station clock, the second hand ticking louder in his mind than it actually was. He had been told 100 times, "Don't be late." In war, timing mattered. Lives depended on it. Around him, the station was full, but strangely quiet. Mothers clutched sons they weren't ready to let go of. Wives smoothed invisible wrinkles from uniforms, memorizing faces they feared might fade. Fathers stood stiff and silent, offering nods instead of hugs because words were too fragile. No one cried openly. Everyone was saving their tears for later just in case. The soldier watched them all, feeling like an outsider to his own moment. His family wasn't there. They lived too far away, and travel was complicated now. He told himself it was easier this way, but a small ache settled in his chest anyway. He thought about home, about the kitchen table where he used to sit, tapping his fingers while his mother cooked, about the creak in the floorboard near the door that always gave him away when he tried to sneak in late, about promises spoken softly the night before he left, promises that felt strong then, but fragile now. He hadn't promised glory. He hadn't promised bravery. He had only promised to come back. That promise followed him like a shadow. The war still felt unreal to him. He had trained for it, prepared for it, listened to speeches about duty and honor, but standing there, watching steam rise from the locomotive in the distance, it felt like the war was something happening somewhere else, to other people. He told himself that once the train started moving, once the station disappeared behind him, it would finally feel real. This was the threshold. One step forward, and there would be no turning back. Someone laughed nearby, a nervous sound that ended too quickly. Another soldier adjusted his pack and muttered a joke about the food, already complaining about something that hadn't even happened yet. The young soldier smiled faintly, grateful for the normalcy of it. These were small human moments, fragile and brief, balanced on the edge of history. He bent down to tighten the strap on his bag, fingers stiff from the cold. When he stood again, the whistle blew sharp, sudden, final. His heart jumped. He looked up at the clock again, confusion flashing across his face. There was still time, or at least he thought there was. He took a step forward, then another, moving closer to where his unit was gathering. The train loomed larger now, metal and steam and inevitability. This was it, the last moment before everything changed. He didn't know that history had already made a different decision for him. He didn't know that this ordinary morning, this forgettable detail in the vast story of war, was about to become the most important moment of his life. Right now, he only knew that he had a train to catch, a duty to fulfill, and a future he couldn't yet imagine slipping quietly out of reach. If this story already has you thinking about how one small moment can change everything, stay with me. What happens next isn't about bullets or battles. It's about fate, guilt, and the quiet power of a moment that looks like failure, but isn't. Into a run without thinking. Not a dramatic sprint, not the kind you see in movies, just an awkward, desperate jog made harder by the weight of his bag and the tightness of his uniform. The platform suddenly felt much longer than it had a moment ago. The whistle's echo still hung in the air, and now the train was alive, hissing, breathing, inching forward. as if it had its own will. "Wait," someone shouted, though he wasn't sure if the voice was his or someone else's. Boots slipped on damp stone. His heart hammered so loudly he could barely hear anything else. He could see his unit ahead, already boarding, their backs turned, focused on getting inside before the doors closed. For a split second, he considered dropping his bag to run faster, but instinct told him not to. Everything he owned, everything he was allowed to bring from his old life into the new one, was in that bag. The doors slammed shut one by one with dull, final thuds. Each sound landed in his chest like a blow. He pushed harder, lungs burning now, cold air slicing into his throat. He reached the last car just as it began to roll past him. He stretched out his hand, fingers grazing cold metal, missing the handle by inches. "Stop," he yelled again, louder this time, panic cracking his voice. The train did not stop. It moved past him slowly at first, then faster, steel wheels clattering against the tracks. Faces appeared briefly in the windows, some curious, some relieved it wasn't them left behind. One soldier, he recognized, pressed his palm against the glass, eyes wide, mouth forming his name. But there was nothing either of them could do. The distance grew, the platform slipping away beneath the train like a closing chapter, and then it was gone. Silence rushed in to replace the noise, heavy and unreal. The platform, once crowded with tension and whispered goodbyes, felt suddenly empty. A few people stared at him. Others looked away, as if his mistake might be contagious. The station clock ticked on, indifferent, cruel in its steadiness. He stood there, bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for air. His legs shook, not just from the run, but from the realization settling into his bones. He had missed the train, missed his unit, missed his deployment in wartime. Missing a train wasn't just being late, it was failure. A station officer approached him, boots clicking sharply. "Name?" the man asked, not unkindly, but without softness. He gave it, voice barely steady. "You were scheduled to leave with that unit," the officer said, glancing down at a clipboard. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," the officer sighed, rubbing his temple. "Report to the administrative office immediately, they'll sort it out." "Sort it out," the words echoed hollowly. He nodded and picked up his bag, suddenly heavier than before. As he walked away from the platform, shame pressed down on him from all sides. He imagined what people would think: coward, careless, unreliable. In his mind, he could already hear the disappointment in his father's voice, the worry in his mother's silence. Inside the office, the air was stale and warm. Papers were stacked everywhere, the machinery of war grinding on through ink and stamps and tired clerks. He stood at attention while his paperwork was examined, his mistake reduced to a line on a form. "You'll be reassigned," a clerk finally said, barely looking up. "For now, you wait. Wait." That was the hardest part. Waiting meant thinking, and thinking meant replaying those few seconds over and over again. If he had walked faster, if he hadn't checked the clock one last time, if he hadn't tightened that strap, 100 tiny choices, all leading to this one outcome. He found a bench in the corner of the station and sat down heavily. The world continued around him. Trains arrived and departed, announcements echoed. Life moved forward even as his felt stuck in place. He wondered where his unit was now, imagined them settling into their seats, joking nervously, staring out windows just like he had planned to do. He didn't know it yet, but that train was carrying more than soldiers. It was carrying fate, and by missing it, he had unknowingly stepped off the path that thousands of others were still following straight into history. Right now, all he felt was failure, a deep, aching sense that he had let everyone down. But sometimes, the moments that feel like the worst mistakes are actually the quiet turning points that save a life. And the war, unforgiving as it was about to prove that truth in a way he could never have imagined. The hours that followed stretched longer than any march he had trained for. Time moved strangely now, no longer measured by whistles or commands, but by the slow crawl of regret. He sat alone on the bench, his bag at his feet, staring at the tracks as if the train might somehow reverse and come back for him. Every distant rumble made his heart lift for half a second before sinking again. It never came back. By late afternoon, the station felt like a different place. The early morning tension had dissolved into routine noise. Civilians passed through with newspapers under their arms. Porters laughed quietly over cigarettes. Life continued, untouched by his private disaster. That was when the guilt really settled in. The war didn't stop because one soldier missed a train. It didn't slow down. It didn't care. He was eventually given temporary lodging nearby. A narrow room with a hard bed, a single chair, and a window that looked out onto an alley. He dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the mattress, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. He had imagined his departure 100 different ways, none of them like this. No final handshake with his unit, no sense of shared purpose as the train pulled away, just silence, paperwork, and an empty room. That night, sleep came in fragments. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the train sliding past him again. He felt the cold metal brush his fingertips, heard the final clatter of wheels on tracks. He woke up sweating, heart racing, convinced he was already too late for something he didn't yet understand. The next morning, orders came through. He was to remain on standby for reassignment. No details, no timeline, just more waiting. He wandered the city when he was allowed, moving through streets full of people who looked untouched by the war, at least for now. Couples argued over groceries. Children kicked balls against brick walls. Somewhere, a radio played cheerful music that felt almost offensive in its optimism. Everywhere he went, he felt out of place. His uniform marked him as someone halfway gone already, a person suspended between civilian life and the unknown. People looked at him with curiosity, sometimes with quiet respect, sometimes with pity. He didn't feel deserving of any of it, not after what had happened. Days passed, then weeks. Letters arrived from home, filled with encouragement and pride, words written under the assumption that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He couldn't bring himself to explain the truth. Not yet. He told himself he would write once he had something better to report, once he could frame the story in a way that didn't sound like failure. Then one afternoon, everything changed. He was called back to the administrative office, the same room where his mistake had been quietly recorded. The clerk's expression was different this time, more serious. He slid a document across the desk without ceremony. "Your original unit," the clerk said slowly, "was rerouted." The words didn't register at first. "Rerouted," he repeated. "Yes, transport changed due to operational adjustments." Something in the man's tone made his stomach tighten. "What happened?" he asked, already afraid of the answer. The clerk hesitated just long enough. There was an attack. The train was hit several hours after departure. The room seemed to tilt. "Casualties?" he whispered. The clerk nodded once. "Heavy." The word landed like a weight on his chest. Heavy. It didn't tell him how many, but it didn't need to. His mind filled in the faces from the platform. The soldier who pressed his hand to the glass, the one who joked about the food. Men who had boarded that train believing, just like he had, that this was simply the next step. He sat down hard, his legs no longer willing to hold him. The realization washed over him in slow, terrifying waves. If he had tightened that strap faster, if he had walked a little quicker, if he had caught the train, he would have been on it. Alive, he realized, because he had failed. The guilt was immediate and crushing. Why them and not him? What right did he have to still be breathing when others weren't? The mistake he had hated himself for was suddenly the reason he was still here. It felt wrong, unfair, almost cruel in its irony. That night, he walked until his feet ached. The city lights blurred as tears finally came, quiet and uncontrollable. He cried for the men who wouldn't write letters home, for the families who would receive folded flags instead, for the version of himself that had almost been lost without ever knowing it. He began to understand something then, something no training manual could teach. Survival isn't always about bravery or strength. Sometimes it's about timing. Sometimes it's about being in the wrong place at the right moment. And sometimes the moments that feel like personal failure are actually the thin line between life and death. He didn't feel lucky. Not yet. He felt changed. From that day on, the war stopped being an abstract idea. It became personal, intimate, stitched into his memory with the faces of men he barely knew but would never forget. He carried them with him, invisible weight in his chest, a quiet promise forming in his heart. If he was still alive, there had to be a reason, and whatever came next, he would carry that truth with him into every moment that followed. The following morning arrived with a grey sky and the low hum of distant trains. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and wet earth, a reminder that the city never truly rested, even when it seemed to pause for no one. He rose before dawn, the thin mattress beneath him offering little comfort, and dressed in the uniform that now felt heavier than the weight of the world. Every button fastened reminded him of what he had survived and what he had lost in his absence. He moved through the quiet streets, his boots echoing on the cracked pavement. Shops were shuttered, the occasional grocer sweeping the front steps or rolling up the metal gates. He kept his head low, hands gripping the straps of his bag, as if the weight of his guilt could be felt physically, pressing down on his shoulders and back. Every step was deliberate, measured, as though moving too quickly might erase the fragile sense of purpose he was trying to cling to. Reaching the administrative office once more, he was greeted not by the usual clerk, but by a sergeant whose eyes held a different kind of intensity. "You're up," the sergeant said, and for a moment he didn't understand. Up for what? Another assignment, another test of endurance? The words didn't come. The sergeant didn't wait. "Orders are in. You're being transferred. New unit, new location. Immediate deployment." The reality settled in slowly like water dripping onto stone. He was being sent into the unknown, and the weight of the previous day's events hung over him like a storm cloud. He felt a flicker of fear, sharp and sudden, but buried it under the discipline that had carried him this far. There was no time for hesitation, no room for the doubt that had plagued him in the quiet hours of reflection. As he boarded the truck that would carry him to the transport hub, he noticed other soldiers, some speaking quietly, others silent with their own thoughts. Each carried baggage beyond the visible, memories of homes left behind, loved ones waiting in the distance, and the constant knowledge that survival was fragile. He kept his gaze forward, focusing on the horizon where the city ended and the unknown began. The journey itself was long, the landscape shifting from urban decay to rolling countryside, and in each small town and forested stretch, he could feel the pulse of anticipation in his chest. He knew that every mile was a step further into danger, yet it was also a step into purpose. He began to think not about what he had missed, or the mistakes he could not undo, but about the responsibility now resting on his shoulders. He carried not only his own life, but also the memory of those who had perished when the train had left without him. By the time the truck arrived at the deployment station, dusk had fallen. The sky was a canvas of muted purples and oranges, and the first stars blinked faintly overhead. Soldiers were disembarking, checking equipment, forming groups, issuing orders. He moved among them, still an outsider in some ways, yet part of the rhythm that had begun long before his arrival. Each order he followed, each task he performed, was underscored by the silent promise he had made to himself. He would honor the lives that were lost by being vigilant, by being present, by not letting fear dictate his actions. Later that evening, as they gathered near a temporary camp, the men shared stories of home, of dreams postponed, of fear and courage, intertwined in ways only those who had faced death could understand. He listened quietly, the faces of his unit blurring into a tapestry of humanity. Each tale reminded him of what he had narrowly escaped and what remained at stake. He realized that survival was not just a physical state, it was a moral responsibility, a commitment to live with awareness and integrity. He lay on his cot that night, the sounds of the camp carrying through the thin walls, the rustle of tents, distant laughter, whispered conversations, and the low, steady breathing of men asleep. Sleep came slowly, each dream haunted by fragments of the train, by the faces of those who had been lost, by the echo of his own choices. Yet beneath the weight of memory and guilt, there was a growing sense of clarity. He understood in a way he hadn't before that the moments of failure and survival were inseparable, each shaping the other. Morning brought preparation and strategy. the careful calibration of readiness before action. He moved with purpose, checking equipment, reviewing maps, memorizing orders, and listening intently to his commanding officers. The memory of the missed train, the lives it carried, and the irony of his own survival became a lens through which he saw the coming challenges. Each decision, each movement, was now informed not only by duty, but by a profound awareness of the fragility and value of life. By midday, the unit was on the move, a long column of vehicles and soldiers threading through the landscape. Dust rose from the wheels and boots, and the heat pressed down relentlessly. But he walked with steady focus, observing everything. Every tree, every hill, every curve of the road became a marker, a reminder that the world continued even as war unfolded around him. He was part of a continuum now, where his presence mattered and his choices bore consequences beyond himself. Through the following days, he adapted to the rhythm of the campaign, the early morning drills, the long stretches of waiting, the sudden bursts of activity that demanded immediate action. Each night, as he reflected on the events and letters he had left unread, he felt the weight of guilt ease slightly, not because it was gone, but because he was channeling it into purpose. He was alive, yes, but alive to witness, to act, to honor. And the missed train was no longer simply a mistake. It was a turning point, a juncture that had carved the shape of the man he was becoming. It had brought him to this moment, among men who depended on one another, in a world where every heartbeat mattered. Survival, responsibility, and remembrance intertwined, forging in him a sense of purpose deeper than fear, stronger than regret, and as enduring as the road ahead. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting long amber streaks across the fields where the unit had set up camp the night before. He awoke to the distant clatter of supplies being organized, and the murmured voices of soldiers still stirring, each sound carrying a rhythm that spoke of routine and unspoken tension. Stretching stiff limbs and taking in the chill of the morning air, he felt the weight of the coming day settle firmly on his shoulders. It was a day that demanded both endurance and vigilance, a test not just of physical stamina, but of the resolve that had carried him from the missed train to this point. He moved among his comrades, exchanging brief nods and curt greetings. Yet each interaction held an undercurrent of shared understanding. The faces around him were etched with fatigue, but behind the tired eyes lay a spark of determination, a silent acknowledgement that they were bound together by circumstance and by choice. Every man carried his own story, and every story was a thread in the intricate tapestry of survival, courage, and sacrifice. Orders came down with brisk clarity, and he fell into formation, the disciplined cadence of the unit becoming almost meditative. Each step was deliberate, each movement precise, as though the very act of marching could align body and mind to the purpose that had been demanded of them. The landscape unfolded gradually, a mixture of rolling hills, dense groves, and winding paths, each bend hiding both opportunity and danger. He kept his gaze sharp, scanning the horizon for movement, assessing the subtle changes in light and shadow that might betray unseen obstacles. During a brief pause, he found himself observing the quiet bravery around him. A young private, barely 19, adjusted the strap on his pack with hands that shook slightly but did not falter. An older corporal, seasoned and scarred, offered guidance with a patience earned through countless trials. The mingling of youth and experience created a fragile equilibrium, a dynamic that required constant attention, empathy, and the occasional intervention to maintain cohesion. As the day pressed on, the unit encountered its first challenge, a narrow ridge that forced them to move single file, each step precarious on loose rocks and uneven terrain. The tension was palpable. One misstep could cascade into disaster. He led the line with measured confidence, offering calm words to those behind him, a reminder that courage was often cultivated in the space between fear and action. The ridge became a crucible, testing not only physical balance, but the quiet resilience that allowed them to persevere when every nerve screamed for retreat. By mid-afternoon, they reached a clearing where temporary rest was allowed. The men spread out, some tending to minor injuries, others sharing sparse rations. He took a moment to breathe, feeling the sweat on his brow and the ache in his legs, and allowed himself a brief reflection. The journey from mist train to this field of challenge had been improbable, almost miraculous. And yet here he was, not just surviving but engaging fully with the responsibilities that had been thrust upon him. Conversations during the pause were hushed, each man reluctant to reveal too much. Yet the shared glances and small gestures spoke volumes. He listened intently, absorbing stories of home, fleeting memories of peace, and whispered hopes that kept them anchored in humanity. The resilience displayed in these fleeting moments offered a profound lesson. Survival was not simply about physical endurance. It was about connection, empathy, and the unwavering commitment to one another. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the terrain, the unit prepared for the next stage of movement. They adjusted their gear, checked equipment, and reaffirmed positions. The meticulous preparation a ritual that safeguarded lives in the uncertain hours ahead. He felt the weight of leadership settle comfortably on his shoulders, not in pride, but in recognition that vigilance and care for others were the true measures of strength. Night fell with surprising rapidity, and the camp was bathed in muted moonlight. Fires flickered in the distance, casting warm glows on faces marked by fatigue, yet illuminated by determination. He lay on his cot, the sounds of the night a symphony of distant calls, rustling leaves, and the soft breathing of men at rest. Sleep was fleeting, punctuated by dreams of past missteps, imagined failures, and the relentless question of whether the next day would demand even more than they could give. Yet, beneath the restless sleep, a quiet clarity emerged. He understood that each challenge faced, each ridge crossed, and each careful observation contributed to a larger purpose. Survival was intertwined with courage, with duty, with the unwavering attention to the lives around him. The mist train was no longer a haunting memory but a catalyst, shaping his choices, sharpening his awareness, and reinforcing the principle that life, once given a second chance, must be met with deliberate action and profound responsibility. By dawn, the camp stirred again, and the lessons of the previous day were internalized. He moved with renewed focus, guided by the understanding that every step forward was not just for himself, but for the collective effort, for those who depended on one another, and for the memory of those lost along the way. This story closed on the realization that courage is most deeply measured in the quiet moments of preparation, in the careful attention to others, and in the steadfast commitment to continue, even when fear and fatigue threatened to dominate. The journey continued, each day building on the last, shaping not just a soldier, but a man who understood the profound weight of responsibility and the enduring power of human resilience.